Welcome to another Dr. Sadler's Honest Book Review. The book that I have to talk about with you today is a slim little volume by Neal Weiner, edited by Tina Lee Forsee. It's called Truth and Generosity, How Truth Makes Language Possible, and it came out in 2023. So in some respects, it's a very recent book, but as we're going to talk about a little bit later, it's actually, in some respects, an older book. So we're going to jump right in and talk about all the different facets of this so you can see whether this is something that you might like to get your hands on and read through and reflect upon. We generally begin with a discussion of three S's: the style of the work, the structure of the work, and a summary of it. And so let's start with the style. It's very readable. It's by somebody who's quite learned and is bringing a number of interesting aspects of philosophy and other disciplines to the table. But the average educated person is going to be able to read and, I would say, also enjoy the prose in this work. There's a lot of great explanations that are given of any sort of tricky terms. The work is an edited work, we could say. That's why both Weiner and Forsee are, listed on the front and included in the copyright. So there's a foreword where she writes, "My husband first drafted this manuscript nearly 20 years ago when he was still teaching at Marlborough College. He retired shortly after, and I suppose at that time he was perfectly happy to stuff the manuscript in a drawer and get back to it someday. I've always felt the book needed to be published, but I also knew how much work that would require. Back then I didn't even know where to begin. Time passed. Neal is now 81 years old, now 83. The last thing he wants to do is spend his retirement years going through the academic publishing process, so I offered to publish it for him." And she goes on and she says, "As for my role, I'm something in between editor and writer because I was working from an old printed copy of a rough draft, and because parts of the book were missing, including the ending. Neal thought it would be easier if I just jumped in and filled in the blanks where necessary. I'm grateful for his trust." So obviously, it's co-written, we could say. And she also tells us, "If I came across a section neither I nor Neal could understand, out with it." We got rid of that part. So maybe the book was originally supposed to be longer and include more stuff. In any case, this is the edition that we have. And it's fairly short. With the main body of it, we have about 103 pages. And it's divided into three main parts, each of which has a short little foreword. Part 1, introducing the principle of generosity. Part 2, generosity and belief. And Part 3, generosity and truth. So, that tells you kind of what the book is about. The generosity aspect would make you think, maybe this is about ethics. And it is indeed about ethics in a way, an ethics of interpretation and reading and engagement with other people's thought. But it's really about language and, we could say, applied epistemology, the relation between language and reality, how we use language. So that's a good portion of the general thematic of the work. It is divided into a number of chapters, some of which are quite short, maybe just a few pages long, some of which are a bit longer, each of which is concerned with elaborating some sort of matter. They are connected together. They are, to some degree, cumulative, but you could read each of the essays, which is effectively what this is, a book of short essays, on their own, and they would be understandable, although they gain by being part of a larger composition. So, what is this? This is, to summarize it, it's philosophical reflections that are oriented around and some connected, really big picture topics. What is philosophy itself? Can we meaningfully talk about there being a meaning to life? Can we communicate with each other? How should we read things? These are all matters that are being grappled with in this. And, Weiner and Forsee are bringing in a number of different theories and considerations from a number of other fields, including linguistics, but also psychology and some, literary theory and stuff like that. All 16 chapters are centering around this principle of generosity that Weiner is articulating here. So that's going to be one of the really key ideas advanced in the work. And that's probably enough of a lead-in at this point. So what are the key ideas of this work? I think it'll be very helpful just to go through each chapter and say what the main idea involved or articulated in that chapter is. But before that, I do want to highlight a couple really big picture matters that we could say are important motifs in this. So in the very introduction, it begins with a quotation from Edward Sapir and bringing up the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is something that 20th century, at least English-speaking philosophy is very concerned with. And it has to do with the connection between languages and ways of seeing and understanding the world, and whether there could be a sort of generalized difficulty of going from one language to the next. The 20th century analytic philosophy of language is very, very concerned with these matters, as were some other fields in the humanities. And, he's going to say at the very beginning, truth is the condition that makes language possible. This is what I hope to demonstrate in this book. And so there's a general argument going on there. There's also some worries as well about some isms that were, not just in the 20th century. There's still big bugaboos in the present day. So he says, what I mean to say is ordinary opinion on the whole has things basically right, and a sensitive and careful distillation of what's presented there is the best approach to seeking truth. But so loud are the voices in favor of old-fashioned skepticism, postmodern relativism, and a plurality of worlds, and they so thoroughly dominate our culture, it often appears as if there's no thoughtful voices in favor of the plain truth. However hopeless it may be to go against the tide, I think common sense deserves a hearing. So it kind of gives you an idea where this is coming from. There's definitely a point of view. I think some of these terms have become so politicized at this point that they have different senses than what Weiner originally meant. For example, the right wing loves the notion of common sense, but it means something very different to them than it has in the history of philosophy and thought. Likewise, postmodern relativism is an easy thing to rail against. And there's other matters as well. I think there is a genuine worry about the humanities in general and philosophy in particular getting taken over by, professional jargony sort of people that runs through this. So in the very first chapter, we have an articulation of the principle of generosity, right? And so what is that? Well, he tells us that when we are interpreting, we should go beyond what he calls the principle of coherence, which is assuming what's being said is relevant to what we are talking about. But we should also go on and say that we should attribute to people who are making statements, authors, whoever, a good interpretation, an interpretation that actually makes sense, that provides meaning, that isn't polemic or tendentious, right? So this is often what we call the principle of charity, but here's how he articulates it. It doesn't mean that the most generous interpretation is always correct. It only means, all things being equal, the generous interpretation is the most likely, right? So he's going to go on and provide a lot of different explanations and examples of this to try to get your head to wrap around this in a, let's say, less didactic and more free-flowing manner. Chapter 2, he immediately turns to some of the problems that are going to arise, violations of the principle of generosity. And he says, there are cases where the principle of generosity is ignored, not so much out of a desire to humiliate, but because speakers have come to distrust each other deeply. And he talks about spouses whose relationship is broke down. We could also talk about the realm of politics, which he brings up as well, where this is a very big danger. Chapter 3 talks about what he calls the poetry of ordinary language, and he says, to demand the literal truth from poetry and obscure sacred texts, a demand we might call one of the defining characteristics of Western philosophy, is to ask for something that was never promised and cannot be delivered. And then he goes on to talk about how Eastern philosophy typically doesn't fall into this problem and gets away from the principle of non-contradiction, and that we need to be a bit more amenable to looseness and ambiguity in language and not so fixated on the literal, and understand that the figurative or metaphorical is involved even in ordinary language. Chapter 4 is called What Language Is Not, and here he wants to criticize several common, up to this point too, ways of looking at language, where I think he's quite right about this. Language is not a code. A lot of people tried to turn it into that. There was an entire projects devoted to that, having a logically perfect language. No, that doesn't actually work. He also points out language is not, strictly speaking, invented, although there are some invented languages, of course, like those we use in computer stuff, Esperanto, but for the most part, language arises. One might even say organically. And then language is not a convention, as he says, meaning it's not, the convention is certainly involved in it, but language is not merely a set of conventions, right? There's more going on there. Then he gets to this interesting chapter, etymology and truth. And what is etymology? It's tracing back the original meanings of terms. And a lot of people get really, really into that. And he's going to say, well, there's also what we call semantic drift. A semantic drift is when the meanings of terms change over time. And we all are familiar with this because it happens with slang, but it also happens with technical language, coining new verbs. Go ahead and Google that. Google would be a neologism. Originally a noun, turns into a verb, and it ceases to stand for merely one kind of search engine, and it means to look up within a search engine, right? That's how it winds its way into the dictionary. And so he says that, without applying the principle of generosity, when we look at older language, we would have to assume people used to believe an enormous number of utterly preposterous, nonsensical, and untrue things. So the principle of generosity applies to older writings, and etymology can be useful for understanding this, but we do have to understand semantic drift and shift. So that takes us then into chapter 6, where he talks about, okay, how does this happen? How do we get semantic changes? And he talks about social influences on this. Interestingly, he's going to use grade inflation in the Vietnam era as an example of the meanings of A, B, C, D, and F. And we'll come back to that a bit later. I usually got some other interesting examples here about the meaning of meat, or the term man, how these things change over time. So that takes us through part one. Part two is about generosity and shared belief. And chapter 7, it's very short. He talks about relativism and how it comes up. What is behind people's interest in relativism as a doctrine? And he says that it's coming out of the fact that people do often have dogmatic points of view, and we do see relativity, and we're drawn to a kind of equality. But do we need to claim epistemological equality, which is what he takes relativism to be about? No, we don't necessarily have to buy into that. And he says, relativism speaks to the demand for an egalitarian society. The question is how to retain its democratic virtues without its nihilistic vice. So then he's going to put forward in the next chapter, Trust and Doubt, what he calls an alternative coming out of ancient philosophy that could stand in place of relativism. He talks about Plato's Republic and Parmenides. He's got some discussions here about Descartes that mostly draw, even in the notes, just on the first of the Meditations. And he wants to say that, ultimately we need to be concerned with the problem of error, but the relativist gets things wrong. They are sometimes correct in cases of dreams and hallucinations, but they're not right in how they approach the general problem. He says, relativism makes the unity of being a mere appearance while preserving the diversity of opinion. What I propose is the reverse. Make diversity of opinion the appearance and preserve the unity of being. So this is kind of a big metaphysical commitment there. But I think one that's quite common. He's going to go on, then chapter 9 is on the origin of language, and he gives you kind of an overview of some of the attempts to try to figure this out. There's not a lot of interest in that, I would say, in contemporary philosophy of language, because we've come to realize we're not going to answer that correctly. And then he advances a very interesting, let's call it a working hypothesis, that the significance, the meaning of lower level linguistic units is actually deriving itself partly from larger units. So there's this section, why sentences precede words. A lot of people think you just get a bunch of words, put them together, now you got a sentence. That's even how we teach it often in classes when we still teach grammar. But it's not really like that. Words emerge in context, and he's got some interesting, thought experiments here about how we could get the sense of rabbits and mammoths and stuff like that as cave people. So he does say this: language begins as an utterly plastic medium, mere sound in search of meaning, and it forces the principle of generosity to shape it to what is directly present. So generosity is playing a role in how we're interpreting things in this sort of prehistorical reconstruction. Then he turns to Quine and Davidson, two 20th century analytic philosophers of language, and the problem of what's called radical interpretation. And this is a problem that used to be a big concern in analytic philosophy of language. How can we ever know that we're interpreting what another speaker is saying correctly? Not even just in our own language. What about in other languages? Can we effectively translate between them? What if we don't know somebody else's language? Can we figure out what they're saying when they point and make words? It's an interesting problem. He goes on in chapter 11, which is titled How We Recognize Language as Language, right? And he contrasts a progressive and traditionalist point of view in this. And he actually points out some stuff that's quite good, right? Sometimes people are like, the Eskimos have 200 words for snow compared to our 1 or 50 or whatever. The Cherokees have words for 14 specific kinds of washing, but none for washing in general. The Hopi think without subjects and predicates. The Chinese must have a radically different understanding of time since their language has no tenses. And, he points out later on, well, that's not quite the case. We have numerous words for snow here ourselves. We have specialized words for washing. There's a root in most Cherokee compounds that takes the place of our general term. The Chinese have adverbs that mark time. The Hopi's blurring of subject and predicate is no different from other languages going through a similar agglutinative phase. So this is good stuff to point out, because a lot of times people throw these things out there and they act as if, well, see, languages can't be translated between them, and language, affects the way that we see the world. So therefore, we can't possibly see snow the way that Inuit do, right? Going on in chapter 12, we start the third section, generosity and truth. And the first chapter, the body of truth, begins by saying, are we justified in dropping the word belief and replacing it with truth? And the answer to that is no. Beliefs and truths are not quite the same thing, but they are connected together. And he points out that, listen, you're not going to get one single conception of truth that is going to capture all that we mean by truth. And then he brings up another really interesting idea in chapter 13, meta-beliefs. Beliefs about what makes a belief and not a fancy, a supposition, or a wish must be at the center of the stable center of our system, since any change in them would affect all others. And because meta-beliefs are indispensable, they must either amount to or rub up against nothing less than the very meaning of truth. Okay, that's a very interesting idea to advance, that our notions of truth are caught up with what he's calling meta-beliefs, which are beliefs about the nature of belief and how beliefs work. And he also says, you can't define them, and we don't have to think that they have to be clear, consciously held, or even coherent with other beliefs. So, that may in fact be quite a promising idea. In chapter 14, he talks about how to apply the principle of generosity beyond the level of propositions, or beyond the sentence, as he says. So we could apply this to literary works. He says that the holistic relationship between word and sentence reappears between sentence and paragraph, though the sentence's dependence on the paragraph is weaker than the word's dependence on the sentence, right? So the paragraph is quite important. And then we can go, he says, how far up does it make sense to go? Well, paragraph to chapter, chapter to book. We could look at an entire work, and we can apply the principle of generosity to that. And he's going to, say that not every work is actually a coherent whole, but a lot of them are. And he's going to say that it is here the textual interpretation overlaps with the broadest possible application of the principle of generosity. Unchecked generosity will want to attribute unity to the largest possible whole, so we can see Homer as a single person, for example, or see the Critique of Pure Reason as having been guided by a single vision, even though he says it was written very poorly and over a long period. And, there's something quite true to that. And then he says, we could even think about somebody like Plato. Plato, we've got individual dialogues, but we can talk about Plato as a whole of texts. He also talks about sacred scripture and how, allegory plays a role in that. And then he goes on to say the truest interpretation is, all else being equal, the one that best fits the parts into a coherent whole. To the extent we cannot make them fit, we cannot really understand the work. The 15th chapter is called the interpretive ideal, and he talks about the imperative to seek teleological perfection in literary whole-part relationships. So, we in fact carry that out. And he says that we can introduce another principle here, the principle of organic composition, which has to do with how parts are associated into wholes. We also have another principle, the principle of non-redundancy. When we see repetition, we should interpret it as saying something more rather than just saying the same thing over and over again. And so, finally, we come to chapter 16. We've talked a lot about language, works. What about the world? We can interpret the world through generosity. And he advances the theory that anthropomorphism is not actually a bad thing. Reading the world along our lines, he says, it's the very essence of generosity. So as a regulative principle, the principle of generosity amounts to a presupposition of what it means to make sense. Running alongside the principle of sufficient reason, things must be assumed to make sense. And so this is going to lead to this, as we talked about, this common sense view of things. And he's going to ultimately say that, maybe the limit of this is what Plato called the good, and which sounds kind of empty, but, there's other ways we could do this. They all end up have to be self-justifying notions. And that's where the book is going to effectively end. Without providing you with some sort of absolute, here's the sum up of it all. He does also provide you with some notes, essentially reading suggestions. Here's, where I'm getting this stuff from. You might want to check this out. Here's a list of philologists, linguists, and philosophers. All of those sorts of things. So that is what's going on in this work. Those are the key ideas of it. All right, what is good about this work? Well, I mentioned that it's very readable. I think it's bringing forth a lot of very interesting ideas, many of which are, of course, coming from other people, but, some of which are arguably Weiner and Forsee at least reformulating some interesting concepts to work with, like the meta-belief notion, right? So, or the articulating things as the principle of generosity, that it's not quite the same thing as the principle of charity, although there's a lot of overlap. I think it's useful for people to read that and think about it, and you can learn a great deal from it. It is advancing a key coherent argument in stages throughout the work. I think that is a good point about it. Making some cases that need to be made or emphasized. I think a lot of people are still quite confused about the nature of language because we use it without thinking too much about it. So, if you get some good ideas from reading this that are, worked out in greater detail elsewhere, that can be quite good as well. I like that he talks about principles and not, say, rules, and that there's always this phrase, all things being equal, which is to show you that these principles are not sort of like a lockstep sort of mechanism that you just throw things into. It's actually principles for us to use intelligently. I actually liked the discussion of grade inflation that came up in the discussion about semantic drift and political motivation. So I'm just going to read you a little bit about this. He said, in the late 60s and early 70s, college professors began grading with B's work that would previously have received a C. As a result, grades changed meaning. A, B, or even a B minus, which had previously been a mildly honorific grade, came to mean merely acceptable or average. A C, which previously meant acceptable or average, came to mean below average. It didn't take long for this Vietnam-era grade inflation, which was well documented at the time, to become well known to those with an interest in these matters, right? So Some attributed it to students performing better. Others saw it as part of the trend towards egalitarian ideals in education. Most believed it to be a response to military draft requirements, which at the time allowed deferments for college students. Grades had become a matter of life and death. So, grade inflation, a concern that we have in the present and people talk about quite a bit. It's been going on longer, at least in America, longer than we suspected. It started when I was a kid, just being born, right? Maybe even a little bit before that. So, that's useful information to find out. Another thing, as I mentioned already, that I really did like quite a bit was the discussion of meta-beliefs. I think this is quite right, that whatever we're going to call them, these play a really important role. And he says that the meta-beliefs don't even have to have been made explicit. It's possible that those with well-articulated epistemologies also hold implicit foundational meta-beliefs that contradict their own explicit views. So there's a lot of incoherence. And then he says the Socratic dialectic specialized in rooting out such contradictions. And there's no special disgrace in getting caught in one of them, nor is it unusual. It would be startling if all our beliefs were completely consistent with the best of our conscious attempts to state them. Surely, very few, if any, are entitled to claim philosophical certainty. I think that's quite right. So I think that's if there's like the most important idea in it, to me, that's the most important idea in the work, not just the principle of generosity, although I think that's pretty important too. So there's a lot of good things to say about this work. Maybe you'll want to read it for those reasons. Are there any problematic aspects of the work? Yes, there's some things that are basically quibbles on my part where I see it and I'm like, that thing again, that's not very good. So, contrasting Western and Eastern philosophy, I don't think that's a very productive way to do things. It's not as if Western philosophy is much more reason-centric and, Eastern is more comfortable with metaphor or, getting away from non-contradiction. I think that's just a bad read on Western, what we call Western philosophy, and then all the different things that get lumped under the broad rubric, which I don't think is a good one, of Eastern philosophy. So when I see that, I'm always a little bit my ears go up, we could say. I think the discussion of René Descartes is misleading. I'm not real happy with that. It sort of replicates bad takes on Descartes that don't read the whole of the Meditations. So, he says, Plato made room for error, and in doing so placed between the world and our awareness a psychological veil. It was the French philosopher René Descartes who turned the veil into an impenetrable wall. Well, that's nonsense. It wasn't until modern times that the problem of error became the problem of knowledge as we know it. Well, that's not true either. I mean, there was Pyrrhonian skepticism in the past. Descartes' method of doubt wears the mask of scrupulous objectivity and says everything commonsensical, poetic, perceptual, or traditional should be set aside in favor of indubitable truth. Well, he has preliminary doubt, but does he actually do that? I mean, just got to read Meditations, 4, 5, and 6 to realize that no, that's not all that's happening in Descartes. So I'm not happy with caricatures of philosophers. I think it violates the very principle that he's talking about here, the principle of generosity. But, as he's pointed out, sometimes we do fall into contradictions. I also think the book could have used more engagement with the vast panorama of 20th century philosophy of language, including, where it veers off into various linguistics or semiotics fields or things like that. Analytic philosophy of language with a little bit of analytic philosophy of science. He mentions Kuhn, for example. Okay, that's good stuff. We shouldn't discount it, but there's a lot more out there that I think this book could have productively engaged in. But again, these are kind of quibbles. These are not reasons why you shouldn't read the book or damning indictments or anything like that. All right, so to sum up, I'm going to give this book a recommendation. I think that it's quite a good read. I also like the fact that it is a collaborative work between this pair, Neal Weiner, Tina Lee Forsee. I think that's pretty cool that they did this together, effectively co-writing. So I'm going to give this a unqualified recommendation as a very interesting short work that you can get through in an afternoon, but I think will enrich your thinking about matters, particularly those having to do with truth and language.